Hey there, it's May already. Thank the Lord that we have gotten through April and we're still here, and hopefully you're still healthy and safe and God is with you. This last week I was asked to teach a Bible study for our general conference website, and I did teach that study, and it was about the cross and how God restores us through great sacrifice. And so what I decided to do is to basically make that the substance for my message this weekend to my church, and to put up on YouTube and Facebook, and I have done that, completed that. It's a rather lengthy message. It's longer than my typical messages are. And for those of you who know me, sometimes my messages are longer than the typical message, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that is there. It's on YouTube and it's on the Facebook page this weekend, and it is available. But here I wanted to just give you a brief summary of what that message was about. As I mentioned, it was about the cross, and of course, the cross is the symbol of Christianity. The cross symbolizes the sacrifice that Jesus made by giving up his life for us. And as I delve into that whole subject, there's a lot to it. But it's a reminder to us that the sacrifice that was made on our behalf to overcome the power of evil on this earth, the power of sin and evil that leads to death. It was an enormous sacrifice. Now, in ancient times, it was very common in just about every ancient religion and every ancient culture to practice some form of child sacrifice. So, you've got a terrible plague going on. So what do we do to get the gods to look favorably upon us when this plague is hitting, and to put an end to the plague? Well, we make some sort of a sacrifice, and so many cultures practice the sacrifice of their own children, thinking that by sacrificing their children, this would somehow appease the gods and take away the plague or the famine or the pestilence or the drought or whatever it was. The idea, though, is that the gods are angry and capricious and they need to be appeased, and it is only by sacrificing the child, this innocent, pure child, to the gods that they can be appeased, and so forth. Well, the thing which sets the God of the Bible apart, the God that was worshipped first by Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the people of Israel, and then who was revealed most fully to us through Jesus Christ and continues to be worshipped today in the followers of Christ in the church. That God does not require the bloodshed of our children to appease him. In fact, God actually is the one who makes the sacrifice. It's God who sacrifices. So John 3:16 says that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And so in that time and in that context, Abraham, who had prayed, and his wife had prayed for years and years and years and years and years, and they had not been able to have a child. And finally, in their old age, Abraham and Sarah miraculously are able to have a child of their own flesh and blood, and they name him Isaac, and they love him, and he's the apple of his father's eye. And so God comes to Abraham and basically says, okay, now I want you to take your boy and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And in the story, and it's found in Genesis 22, the story, Abraham complies. He doesn't seem surprised at all. He willingly carries through, and he takes Isaac, who's probably a young teenager by this time, certainly probably able to get away from his father if he wants to, but But Isaac, in his complete submission, goes with his father on this journey. And Abraham sets up the altar and takes his son and binds him up. And Isaac willingly submits to this, even though in his mind he's probably thinking, what on earth is happening, right? Why did Abraham do that? Well, number one, because Abraham had seen that this was a common practice in the other religions, the Canaanite religion and the other religions that surrounded him. And so, he probably said, well, okay, well, God is like all the other gods. He wants to have this sacrifice done to appease him. But just at the point where Abraham is willing to follow through with the sacrifice, God sends his angel and says, wait, Abraham, no, don't do this. No. He says, okay, now I know that you're willing to do this, but don't do it, because I don't require my people to sacrifice their children. Right? So God reveals through this very powerful story that he is not like the gods of the other nations. He does not require us to sacrifice our children. But as the story of the Bible unfolds, and as we come over into the story of the Gospels, we see that Jesus, who is the Son of God, God sacrifices his own Son, right? God does what he does not require any of us to do. He sacrifices, he gives as a gift his own Son. Now, why does he do that? Well, the Bible is pretty clear about why God does this. It is to defeat the powers of evil, right? Back in the very beginning of Genesis chapter 3, the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the garden, and after the Adam and Eve have tasted of the forbidden fruit and they have violated God's commandments, and they listen to the voice of the tempter, God lays out his punishment, and he says to the serpent, who the serpent is representative of evil, this fallen, broken evil in the universe that is out to oppose God, that is out to seek its own worship. It says in Genesis 3:14 and 15, the serpent, it says that you will crawl on your belly, right, and you will be crushed by the seed, the offspring, the descendant of the woman. So there was going to be an offspring, a descendant, a human offspring of Eve would one day crush evil, right? So this is the epic battle between good and evil that is laid out at the very beginning of the Bible. It's going to come to its head, and a descendant of that woman, an heir, a seed of the woman, is one day going to crush evil. But in the midst, it says, you will bruise his heel. So you might picture the metaphor then of a serpent. What does a serpent do? It lashes out, it takes its poison and bites the heel of this man. So even as this epic battle is going on, and he's stomping on the serpent to crush it and ultimately destroy it, but in the process, the serpent spits forth his venom into the man. So there is pain, there is suffering on the part of the one whose heel is bruised. And we see how that story holds out then. The death of Jesus, Jesus goes to the cross. He's bruised. Isaiah 53 says he's bruised for our transgressions, wounded for our iniquities. So Jesus experiences his own suffering. And yet in the process of defeating and overpowering evil, Jesus is bruised. He's hurt on the cross. But it is not an ultimate defeat, right? Because Jesus' time on the cross, while painful, while he endures more pain and suffering than any person ever has in the history of the world, Jesus bears upon himself that, and on the cross, the full weight of sinful humanity in opposition to our good and loving Creator, right? And he does this in order to defeat the powers of evil and darkness. And so that process begins on the cross. But then, of course, the power of God is greater than the power of evil, and Jesus is raised up from death to everlasting life, where he is alive today. And he will one day come, and of course the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible, the very end, shows ultimately that Christ returns and brings to a final climax this evil, broken system that is operating in the world today under the power of the evil one, the serpent of Genesis, otherwise known as the devil or the Satan or the adversary. But it is this thing of being in opposition to God and putting forth idolatry. And Jesus finally brings an end to that so that the world once again, with one united heart and one united voice, serves, worships, honors the true God, right? So Jesus is enacting this long-promised battle against evil and beginning the process of bringing about the ultimate destruction of the evil one. And he does this on the cross, and it is by the sacrifice. So God makes the sacrifice by giving his Son. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Jesus makes the ultimate sacrifice by giving his life, right? In the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is getting ready to meet up with Judas and those from the temple guard who are coming to arrest him, and he's praying one last time, and he says, God, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. In other words, I don't want to go through with this. I don't want to have to endure the suffering that I know will happen if I continue this journey. But then he says, but nevertheless, it's not my will, but your will be done. So Jesus is willing to surrender his will and makes that ultimate sacrifice, right? So God, our Father, makes the sacrifice, giving his Son for our sins. The Son, Jesus Christ, makes the sacrifice by allowing himself to go to the cross. But then Jesus talks to his disciples, his followers, and said, if anybody wants to be my follower, if you want to follow after me, then you too must be willing to take up your cross, and you need to come after me, right? So Jesus is saying, hey, if you're going to follow me in this life, if you're going to join my mission, which is to bring an end to the powers of evil and sin and death in the world, to expose the powers, and that's what Jesus did on the cross. He exposed the evil powers, right? At that time, it was the evil powers operating in religion, in the synagogue, in the temple, the high priesthood, the Sanhedrin of the Jewish people. It was the evil powers at work in the Roman Empire, where Pilate, who had the legal power to not allow an innocent man to be taken out because the mob said they wanted him dead, right? Pilate had the power and represented the most powerful empire in the world, Rome. He could have put a stop to it, but he didn't. So the cross exposes these powers, how people were willing to reject the truth, reject God, the lie, cover up the truth, and all of this, exposing the power of evil. And that's how evil still works today, by the way, right? And so the church, the followers of Jesus, we still need to be in the process of exposing the powers of evil and darkness that continue to operate in our world today. And if we're going to do that, then it calls for us to also make sacrifices, right? So what are we willing to sacrifice in order to truly follow Jesus? If anyone wants to follow me, let him take up his cross or her cross and follow me. Whoever would gain their life shall lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake shall find it. And so then Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a young German pastor in the 1930s and had come over to the United States to teach in a seminary here in the United States. And so he was away from the battle that was going on in his own native Germany as Hitler and the Nazi powers were rising to power. Talk about the powers of darkness. Talk about evil incarnate going on through the person of Hitler and the Nazi party. And yet Bonhoeffer, who was here in the United States and in relative safety and security, made the very difficult decision. He chose to go back and to be with his church in Germany, those who had not fallen in with Hitler and the Nazi Party, those Christians who were choosing to stand for what they believed to be right, taking a stand against the evil and injustice that was happening in Hitler's Nazi Germany. And Bonhoeffer joined in the resistance against that. And as a result, Bonhoeffer ultimately paid with his own life. He was executed by the Nazis. But Bonhoeffer, in his book Discipleship, or The Cost of Discipleship, as it is known, he famously said, when Christ calls a man, when Christ calls a person, he's calling them to come and die, right? And there are different things that we have to die to. For Bonhoeffer, he had to die to the security and safety that he was experiencing here in the United States in order to go back and be with his people and to resist. So sometimes God calls each of us to follow Christ, and we have to die to different things. But there is a sacrifice involved as we join Christ in his mission to expose these evil powers that continue to work, the powers of evil and darkness in the world today, in the many different ways that it operates, in the many different idolatries that happen in our world today. And yet we join in following Jesus Christ. And in doing so, we take up our own crosses. And in doing so, sometimes we also are called to suffer. You cannot carry a cross without suffering. So in Philippians 3:10, the Apostle Paul says, I want to know Christ, right? I want to know Christ. I want to know Jesus. And I want to know the power of his resurrection. Paul is looking to the future, to the ultimate goal, the resurrection at the coming of Jesus Christ. But he says, how do I do that? How do I get to sharing in the power of the resurrection? Well, I have to share by becoming like him in his suffering, right? There's an old song that used to say, if you don't wear the cross, then you can't, if you don't bear the cross, then you can't wear the crown. And that's true. So God suffers with the cross by allowing his only begotten Son to die to bring about the defeat of the powers of evil. Jesus suffers by surrendering his life and his will to the will of his Father, which is necessary to bring about the end of suffering. And then we are called to follow Christ. And so that means that we will take up our own crosses and that we will bear the cross, that we too will participate in the sufferings of Jesus. So the cross touches all of us. I don't know what crosses God may be calling you to bear. You may be bearing some now. You may have some crosses to bear in your future. But understand that the purpose of the cross, ultimately is to expose the evil powers of darkness that are operating still today. They have not been fully destroyed. The process of exposing them has begun. The process of bringing their ultimate defeat has begun. But there's still a battle going on, and it will continue to go on until the return of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we are called upon every day to participate in this battle against evil. Romans 16:20, Paul says to the church that the Lord is going to soon crush Satan under your feet, right? So that very passage in Genesis 3:15 about the seed of the woman crushing the serpent, right? Defeating evil. It begins with Jesus Christ on the cross, but we become participants of that. Every time you and I take a stand against evil, against idolatry, against the darkness that continues to operate in the world today, that we expose it and that we take a stand against it, we are joining Christ in bringing about the crushing of the evil one. As I said, If you want to listen, there's considerably more. This is just an abbreviated version, but if you want to listen to the full story, I invite you to check out that message. It's also going to be on this YouTube, and it's called The Cross, God Restores Us Through a Great Sacrifice. But I pray God blesses you today as you go forward, that you join in following Jesus Christ, that you join in his defeating the powers of evil and darkness. That is our calling as his people today. God bless you.